Have you heard of Lemuria? That mythical lost continent once believed to have existed somewhere between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. An idea that became all the rage. But where did this belief come from? And why did it grip the imagination of so many in the 19th century? Time to distinguish fable from fact, here on Things Visible and Invisible. Justin McHenry is a writer, historian, and university archivist at the American Public University System. His latest published work from Feral House is Lemuria, a true story of a fake place. And he joins me down the line from his home in West Virginia. Justin, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you so much, Sean, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on with you and talking about lost continents.
Justin, the first question that comes to mind when I was looking at your book is, how did you come across this now rather obscure idea?
That's a great question. From an early age, I have been just fascinated with everything weird and bizarre and strange. And so just for decades and decades now, I've been picking up little pieces of that kind of weird esoterica all over the place. And a little bit of Madame Blavatsky here, a little bit of like Mount Shasta lore here, like UFOs and Bigfoot and all that kind of stuff. And each time, each piece, you hear a little bit Lemuria. You just hear that word, Lemuria, Lemuria, Lemuria. And so like a lot of people right around COVID, I was looking for some extra stuff to do when I was in lockdown. And so I was like, well, I keep hearing about this Lemuria. I want to dig more into it. And so, that's basically how it came about, is just knowing these little bits and pieces, knowing about Richard Shaver and the Shaver mysteries and Madame Blavatsky and all of her work with Theosophy. And just picking up those pieces and like just wanting to learn more and wanting to dive in more. And then when I started to dive in more, I found that, a lot of not has been seriously written about it. And it's also just a super fascinating story about this lost continent out there in the Pacific Ocean.
Well, it is a super fascinating story, and we're going to get into it now because you are now the resident expert on this rather bizarre place. So let's begin at the beginning, because now we will get into the claims about prehistory and so on and so forth, but maybe the beginning for Lemuria is actually rather prosaic.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So for people maybe who don't know what Lemuria is, Lemuria is the great lost continent of the Pacific and Indian Ocean. So it can cover two oceans. That's one of the fascinating things about Lemuria. So most people will know about Atlantis and how Atlantis is the great lost continent of the Atlantic Ocean. A lot of people don't really know so much about its Pacific cousin, Lemuria. And that's kind of how it got its start too, was back in the 19th century. You have a bunch of scientists just getting worried, getting like interested in animal migration and how animals like moved about the continents, and how can you have basically lemur. I got my lemur back here. Lemur and lemur-like creatures inhabiting places like South America, Africa, Madagascar, and in Asia. And so that's kind of like where Lemuria comes from. Is they had this scientist that Philip Lutley Sclater, who was interested in basically the mammals of Madagascar and how all the animals got on to Madagascar, because Madagascar is a continent, or is a island out there off of the coast of Africa. And so there had to have been a way to get animals onto Madagascar. And so he theorized that there was a land bridge that connected South America to Africa and Africa to Madagascar and Madagascar on to Asia. And so because lemurs are the primary primate on Madagascar, he was like, you know what, let's just call this land bridge Lemuria. And so the name was very sticky. He was really good at creating names. And so the name kind of stuck and people just started picking up and took it for fact.
So this is, if I can put it like this, Justin, this is a kind of solution to a zoological problem, right? It's something that zoologists were thinking about. And so they create a possibility of a landmass. And I mean, it as a theory, as a scientific possibility, it's not out of this world. However, this is not exactly then how this concept plays out. It moves very quickly from zoology to other disciplines, and then all bets are off after a while. What happened in the story to move it so quickly from the realm of respectable science to, shall we say, more exploratory thinking?
Yeah, well, right around the time that he names Lemuria, this land bridge that connecting all of these continents together, was also right around the time of Darwin and Darwinism, and evolution was starting to become a kind of like a scientific fact, or a piece of science that was being more heralded by scientists. And so they had a scientist, a German scientist by the name of um, oh shoot, Ernst Haeckel, who was a big time evolutionary scientist from the 19th century, and he um, was kind of like following in Darwin's coattails. He was actually Darwin's like biggest hype man in the 19th century. He was that one that kind of helped popularize the idea of evolution and bring it to the masses, unlike Darwin did with his books. Haeckel's books were a little bit more popular and more wide read by the populace. And so when he was sitting there discussing, human evolution, he needed a place for human evolution to happen on, and he needed like a Goldilocks zone, like the perfect area, perfect landmass for this all to happen. And for him, that was Lemuria. So we had this, already a scientist has named Lemuria as this land bridge out kind of in the Indian Ocean. And so that's where Haeckel kind of like took it up even further and helped like legitimize Lemuria as a scientific fact, that it did exist out here, because that's where he placed the evolution of man was happening there on Lemuria. The perfect conditions were needed, where the migration out of Lemuria happened were for mankind, and you had all the different races of people traveling to Africa and Asia and into Europe and elsewhere. And he was putting that all in Lemuria. So that's kind of how it became this theoretical place, and now it became a little bit more realistic place and kind of prehistory, with the Ernst Haeckel doing that.
But
You would have following up on Ernst Haeckel, you have other like evolutionary scientists, like you know what, a big thing in evolutionary science was finding the missing link. You hear that term missing link, and so you had a Dutch evolutionist kind of going out into the Dutch East Indies, into Java, and doing his own, you know, excavations and archaeological digs looking for this missing link. And he actually found what would become known as Homo erectus out there in Java. And it was, known as the Java man. So that kind of helped even further solidify Lemuria as this location, as this actual scientific location that was real at one point in time.
But just to clarify, Justin, I mean, from your researches in particular, I mean, we have an idea that's posited to correct a zoological problem, and now we have scientists who are into evolution, who are using that very sort of tenuous idea to build a framework for the missing link and the whole history of humanity. I mean, is it too much to say that we're not dealing here with science, we're dealing with florid imaginations?
It really is. And like, that's the funny thing about 19th century science too. There wasn't it wasn't as specialized as we think of science today. A lot of times scientists now like hyper focus on a certain topic or a certain, area of study. But these 19th century scientists, man, they were dabbling in everything. They had their hands in everything. Another key figure in this period was a a British scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was kind of highly like he was into everything. He was a evolutionary um, pioneer. He was into bugs. He was into finding life on Mars. He was into like social issues there in England. He was also into flat Earth and disproving flat Earth theory back in the day. So you have these scientists who are kind of like all over the place. And so I think that kind of helps with that aspect of like, kind of leads to abstract thinking and just, be able to see, with this idea of Lemuria will help how would that help my ideas on evolution, or how would that help my ideas on, getting, mammals onto certain islands in the Pacific and things like that.
I like the way, Justin, you say it leads to abstract thinking. Some might suggest it leads to a lack of thinking, actually, when it comes to Lemuria. But anyway, let's continue with the tale. So,
About it, I guess.
yes, so the whole concept of this mythical civilization, long lost, starts to gain currency amongst reputable figures, people who are scientists, people who are engaged in hard science, as we would term it today. How does it start? I mean, it starts to snowball at this point, and more people become involved in it. It's almost like everybody's in on it at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what's kind of funny. It's like a confluence of ideas are coming together right there because at the time when Ernst Haeckel was writing his books, like the history of creation, you have this figure, a guy, American politician, a guy by the name of Ignatius Donnelly, who was writing his very influential book on Atlantis, who kind of brought Atlantis back into the forefront. And so you have these ideas on lost continents starting to come together there in like the 1870s and 1880s, and it is building this kind of groundswell for like prehistoric pseudo history, basically, of what took place back then and how can we go about finding what happened to these places.
In a way, though, I mean, although we're sort of slightly laughing about it, I mean, the concepts were being used, or the concept of Lemuria was being used by other people to prove whatever it was that they were hawking at the time, be it evolution or whatever it was. I mean, Atlantis to some extent as well was playing in with this. Or is that too cruel to say that, Justin, that basically these were becoming ciphers for other people's agendas?
Yeah, and that will be a through line through Lemuria's history, is its malleability and it's a blank slate, basically, what people can, graft onto it what they want Lemuria to be, just because it never really existed, so it can be whatever you want it to be, and so people took advantage of that and are still taking advantage of that. So in the 19th century, that takes the form of, these zoological issues, and also with evolutionary issues, or looking at comparative cultural analysis, like Donnelly was doing to try to prove the existence of Atlantis and Lemuria. And you have other people who are like piggybacking onto those arguments, like Madame Blavatsky, and who takes it into a completely different direction.
Well, and we're going to get into that, but just before we do, Justin, talk to me a little bit about how what was a narrow scientific discussion, how that started to permeate the wider culture. I mean, how prevalent were debates about these lost civilizations at the end of the 19th century amongst the mainstream, the general population?
Well, like I think Atlantis is a perfect example there because of the popularity of Ignatius Donnelly's book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Um, the very following year, the Atlantis is the theme of Mardi Gras that year in New Orleans. And his book stays in publication for almost 100 years, like in continuous print for almost 100 years. And also, like, you get the Donovan song Atlantis is directly from Ignatius Donnelly's book and Madame Blavatsky. And you and you also think about the world of the 19th century as well, and also this specific point in time in 19th century where industrialization is happening. Put a little bit more history context into it. You got more widespread press. The newspaper is being read by more and more people around the world, and it's becoming more, easily available as forms. And so a lot of newspapers will pick up coverage of Donnelly's book or Ernst Haeckel's thing. So they need stories to run their press, and so you will see a lot of stories, in the newspapers from that period dealing with these people and these topics, and also like the 19th century version of YouTube was, Ernst Haeckel delivering lectures or Ignatius Donnelly delivering talks or people like this. And so that would draw people in. That'll be a more accepted way of like receiving information, was to go and hear these people talks or to read their books and things like that.
Was there much pushback from other scientists or from historians, or was the academy sort of pushing back at what ultimately was a kind of pseudoscience, a pseudo-historical understanding?
You have a little bit of that. I don't think Donnelly was ever taken seriously by scientists of his day, so they didn't really pay him too much attention. But what's kind of funny in the discourse around someone like Ernst Haeckel is that you basically have, Darwinist and anti-Darwinist. And so the anti-Darwinists were not focused so much on trashing Lemuria. They were focused on trashing the idea of natural selection happening, just because it goes against, well, basically their whole careers, because they spent their whole careers on a creationist kind of thinking. And so if evolution were to be true, then that would just, negate all of the work they have done their whole lives. So you don't have them focusing so much on disproving that Lemuria ever happened, or other scientists coming through and saying, there was never a land bridge that connected all of these continents. You would have them basically saying, yes, anding them and trying to come up with, fine tuning the idea that, of these land bridges connecting continents, or, Lemuria was a, Goldilocks area for, human evolution to take place on. Yeah. So like when the last episode where we talked about the dry science and evolution and zoology and all that stuff, this is now where Lemuria gets weird and gets funky, and it's party time.
Well, let's party. Where shall we start in this? I mean, when did Lemuria move from the scientific establishment into more esoteric territory?
Well, you can lay it all on one person, and that is Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And with her and her work, The Secret Doctrine, that kind of completely turned Lemuria on its head and sent it down just a weird, bizarre road that it's still traveling on right now.
Okay, so we better just give a little bit of a thumbnail as to who she was, at the forefront of something known as Theosophy, which was, I mean, how would you describe it, Justin? It's a kind of a new religion, a ragbag of various religions?
It is. Theosophy is I wouldn't necessarily call it religion. It's a embrace of multiple religions and multiple ideas. Mostly Blavatsky was really good for synthesizing Eastern ideas, like from Hinduism and Buddhism, and bringing them to the West and popularizing those ideas um, that were out there in the East for thousands and thousands of years. But she was kind of one of the first people to bring that to the West and open the West mind to these Eastern ideas. And she was also very much embraced spiritualism that was going on in America and in Europe in the 1870s and 1880s at the time. So that's like doing seances and just be able to communicate with these spirit beings that are all around us. And so you kind of have these two ideas that kind of merge into one with Madame Blavatsky. And she is one of the most fascinating people probably of the 19th century, one of the most, I believe, consequential figures of the 19th century, just because of how she popularized those ideas, which are still around today, and the influence, either negative or positive, it depends on your viewpoint. But like without her, like all of the you know little Buddhist trappings that Westerners have, or yoga that we do, or things like that, was kind of like inspired and came through her influence and everything that she was putting on with the Theosophical Society there in the late 19th century.
And I think it's right to say, Justin, that Madame Blavatsky and her teaching had a huge influence, maybe more on the intelligentsia of her day. But how did she? I mean, why? Maybe the question is, why did she come across this concept of this lost civilization, and how did she incorporate it into her thinking at that time?
Yeah, well, so she was a very, very fascinating woman who was kind of brilliant in her own sort of way, just because she was able to synthesize the ideas that were going on in the 19th century around her and bottle them up and redirect them towards her own ideas and things like that. And so she was, while Ernst Haeckel and others were concerned with the material evolution of mankind, she was interested in the spiritual evolution of mankind. So, you have all this talk going on around her about, debates on evolution, if evolution was real, and, with man came from apes and things like that. She took that a step further and was like, what, we didn't come from apes. We came from, beings from the stars. That's where we really evolved from. And so she created this, or she didn't create it, I should say. She channeled Tibetan masters in a secret Tibetan language. They came to her and gave her this idea of spiritual evolution of mankind that, kind of happened on Earth, and where we were, vaporous beings, and then we've evolved into slightly less vaporous beings, and then we became, physical beings. And that first physical transformation for Madame Blavatsky happened on Lemuria. And so where we became these solid beings, and when I say beings, she makes it very clear that they're not humans at that point. We're cyclopes, we're, just large, kind of like giant creatures. And over the course of our time on Lemuria, we slowly evolved into humans. And then when we finally reach our human things, Lemuria, sinks into the ocean, and humans go and migrate to Atlantis and continue the, spiritual evolution. So for her, Atlantis plays a key role in being that first, that segment where we kind of become a solidified spiritual being here on Earth.
And how did this play out then amongst not just her devotees and her followers, but how did it play out? I mean, did people suddenly say, this is, quote unquote, the missing link for our spiritual advancement and enlightenment? Did Lemuria suddenly become a kind of fabled place that it hadn't been perhaps in the 19th century?
Yes, it did. And it's what's funny is just because of her quasi channeling of these beings, you have a lot of what I call the second wave of Theosophist kind of further channeling her, using channeling to dig in deeper into, Earth's past. And so you have her second in command, basically, Annie Besant, and her, best bud, Charles Leadbeater, were get together and they do these kind of like magical mystery tours where they project themselves back in the past. And so they projected themselves back into Lemuria and describe what was happening in Lemuria. And they describe, wicker basket from the moon, filled with Lemurians coming down to Earth to teach the ape-like creatures that were on here civilizations, and other wicker baskets coming from Venus onto Earth, and fighting with dinosaurs basically. And then you have someone else like Rudolf Steiner who was doing something similar, projecting himself back into Lemuria. And he has, what's funny is like Lemuria takes the shape of whatever you want it to be and whatever your interests are. And so where I guess Besant and Leadbeater were interested in, the more space elements of Lemuria. Rudolf Steiner, of course, was more interested in education and farming and agriculture and things like that. And so his Lemuria is way, way different. And it's basically Lemurians for him were almost Jedi-like, where they can move structures with their minds. And they have, like he describes their school systems and things like that. And so you have these people who are turning Lemuria into this very spiritualized place of, and where, in the past, where they're talking about evolutionary as a set place, now it's becoming more of a mystical place.
Well, in some ways, though, I mean, Lemuria, because of its lack of any validity, scientific, historic, or otherwise, it's really a kind of beautiful idea that anybody, as you've just said, can take and use for their own purpose. It becomes a kind of landing zone for anybody who has any idea. If you just said we've had zoologists who've used it for their scientific ideas. We've had evolutionists using it and now we've got Madame Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and others who are also all landing on this wonderful civilization that never existed. I mean, was there anybody holding up their hands and saying, "Wait a minute, guys, this is a total fantasy. This never existed. It was dreamed up by a zoologist to work out a problem of migration of animals."
Well, it's like would you say that about Hogwarts or something like that? Like, it's like, did that ever exist? And like, how do you argue with someone who says it did exist? So it's almost a fool's errand in its own way of trying to combat the existence of a place like Lemuria to somebody who believes in it.
But was there any debates even amongst some of these groups that people were saying, well, wait a minute, this is all good, but there's no real validity. That was there not an ability to see that nailing their colours to something which was so fantastic and fantastical would actually dilute any other ideas they might have, which might have some semblance of basis in reality?
No, actually, just the opposite would happen, especially with what you get with Besant and Leadbeater and Steiner, because you have these two competing visions of Lemuria, and it's almost like instead of just one, faction saying, this place never existed, they're doubling down and saying, oh, it did exist. It's just not the way it existed for you. It's something completely way different. Like it's not like this is my Lemuria, not your Lemuria.
So moving sort of through the 20th century, Justin, how did Lemuria? What's the afterlife of Lemuria? Did it sort of die a death with some of those ideas that were very a la mode at the start of the 20th century around Theosophy and other things, which began to permeate the counterculture by the 1960s, but more or less had run their course? Was Lemuria in that sort of vein?
I mean, in a way, yes. You'll still find especially in the alternative religious areas like Mount Shasta in California. Um, it's still very much prevalent in those circles, and it's gotten even more mystical and more. Actually, a weird thing happened with it, and especially towards as it gets closer and closer to our timeline here in the 21st century, where it starts to become like Blavatsky and Steiner and those people turned it into this mystical place, and it stays this mystical place, and it is still a mystical place, but instead of being like almost a utopia, it turns into a dystopian allegory for us, and how um, if we allow wokeness into Lemuria allowed wokeness into its society, and that's what led to its destruction. And so it's a tale for us now, like that's people use as a warning, saying, this is what happens when you allow, all of this in society that's going on now. It destroyed Lemuria, and so you get this kind of like merging of right-wing political ideas with these woo-woo alternative religions, and they're coming together, and they seem to agree on what happened with Lemuria, and how it came to pass was because of people just being persecuted for their beliefs and things like that.
Well, now that you've written a book about it, Justin, have you ever considered becoming a sort of travel agent for Lemuria? Because if people actually believe it exists, you could probably sell them tours of it, right?
Yeah, that would be an amazing thing. Like, especially you can have Lemuria anywhere. Like I can have it here in West Virginia, in the mountains of West Virginia. There's a little piece of Lemuria out there, and for a few $1,000s, you can come on down, and I can show it to you. I think one of the most interesting things about Lemuria to me is people still have interactions with Lemurians to this day. Even though Lemuria is a made-up word by Philip Lutley Sclater, Lemurians is a made-up word as well, but people are still interacting somehow with beings that are claiming to be Lemurians. And so I just think I don't know what's going on in people's heads or in people's brains that are like making that connection, that they're having these, one-on-one conversations or one-on-one, interactions with these kind of spiritual beings claiming to be from Lemuria or Lemurians themselves.
Well, I love your title, Justin, a true story of a fake place. It couldn't have been put better. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our journey to Lemuria. Tell people, though, where they can find out more about you and where they can pick up a copy of your wonderful book.
Yeah, so the book is Lemuria, a true story of a fake place. You can pick it up wherever you buy books. Just look it up online. Hopefully it's in a bookstore near you. You can find me and my work online at my Substack. I have a Substack. It is called Our Belated Past, and you can also find some more history-related ramblings of me on Instagram from Justin Loves History.
For now, Justin, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.